Arizona Territory, 1882. Was not kind to women who thought for themselves. Dusty Ridge sat under a wide, unforgiving sky. A town stitched together by cattle money, railroad rumors, and men who believed they understood how the world ought to run. It wasn't the worst place in the territory, but it was proud. Proud of its church bell. Proud of its new bank. Proud of its reputation for order. Order in Dusty Ridge meant knowing your place. When Eleanor Bennett stepped off the stagecoach with one leather trunk and a stack of books tied in twine, no one imagined she would threaten that order. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dressed scandalously. She wore a simple traveling dress, gloves despite the heat, and carried herself like someone accustomed to being heard. That was the first problem. She introduced herself as a teacher from St. Louis, said she planned to open a small schoolhouse. At first, folks approved. A school made a town respectable. But approval began to sour when they learned who she intended to teach. Not just the white ranchers' sons, not just the daughters, either which raised eyebrows on its own, but Mexican children from the south end of town, and Apache children from families camped beyond the ridge. That was when smiles turned thin. The American West in the 1880s was layered with tension most towns pretended not to see. The Civil War had ended less than 20 years earlier. Reconstruction had failed many. Railroads were cutting across native lands. Government policy pushed native children into boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their language. Cultural erasure was often disguised as civilizing. Dusty Ridge considered itself modern, but only in ways that benefited men with property. Eleanor, however, believed education belonged to everyone. She rented a small abandoned supply shed and cleaned it herself. Scrubbed the floors. Patched the windows. Painted a crude sign. Schoolhouse. The first week, only 3 children came. A Mexican girl named Rosa, whose father worked cattle but never learned to read contracts he signed. 2 Apache brothers, quiet and watchful. By the second week, 5 more arrived. Word spread that Miss Bennett did not punish children for speaking Spanish, that she did not wash mouths with soap for speaking Apache words, that she taught English reading and arithmetic but did not mock accents. For families long treated as invisible, that mattered. For the town council, it was a warning bell. Men like Sheriff Calloway and Banker Whitmore gathered in the back room of the saloon to discuss concerns. They didn't call it prejudice. They called it stability. If you start mixing everyone together, Whitmore muttered, you invite trouble. Trouble meant change. And change meant losing control. Eleanor's second offense was speaking publicly. During a Sunday social, she suggested that educating girls would strengthen families. She mentioned that contracts and land deeds were easier to defend if one could read them. A rancher laughed. Women don't need legal knowledge. She met his gaze calmly. Ignorance benefits only the dishonest. That sentence traveled through town faster than wildfire. Now, she wasn't just teaching the wrong children. She was challenging male authority. And in the Vatat and in the 1880s frontier, a woman who refused to lower her eyes unsettled men more than any outlaw. The town could not arrest her. She broke no laws. They could not publicly shame her. She carried herself too cleanly for scandal. So they chose something quieter. Disappearance. The West had 1,000 ways to make someone vanish. A body lost in desert heat. A bandit attack. A wagon that never reached its destination. No investigation. No headlines. Just dust swallowing the evidence. They justified it as protection. They told themselves she would incite conflict between settlers and Apache families. They whispered that she might attract federal attention. They framed it as necessary. This is how injustice often begins, not with monsters, But with ordinary people convincing themselves that cruelty is practical, the council pooled money discreetly. Not enough to draw attention, enough to hire someone skilled. They didn't want noise, they wanted certainty. Through a trader familiar with reservation routes, they sent word, find an Apache tracker. Someone who knew the desert's hidden canyons. Someone who could erase footprints. Like they'd never been there, they assumed any Apache man would resent a white woman interfering in native affairs. They assumed loyalty could be bought. They assumed wrong. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued teaching. Unaware of the decision forming behind closed doors. Each morning, she rang a small brass bell. Each afternoon, she walked home alone, carrying lesson slates and hope heavier than her books. She wrote letters back east describing the beauty of the desert sunset. She described her dream. A school where children learned to read without being told their heritage was shameful. She did not know her dream frightened men more than guns ever could, because guns threaten bodies, ideas, threaten power. And in Dusty Ridge, power was something men protected fiercely. So they hired a stranger to end her story. Before Dusty Ridge ever heard his name, Dakota had already learned how to survive in silence. He was born during a time when survival itself felt like resistance. The Apache people had endured decades of forced relocation, broken treaties, and military campaigns meant to drive them from ancestral lands. By the 1880s, many Apache bands had been pushed onto reservations where rations were controlled, movement was restricted, and traditions were treated as obstacles instead of treasures. Dakota grew up hearing two languages. The first was his mother's, rich with stories of mountain spirits, honor, and kinship. A language where land was not owned but belonged to all who respected it. The second was English, hard-edged, practical, learned from a missionary who believed education might save Apache children from their own culture. Dakota learned quickly that knowledge itself was not the enemy, but the intention behind it mattered. As a boy, he watched soldiers burn dwellings built from mesquite and mud. He watched elders forced to sign documents they could not read. He watched children taken to distant boarding schools where their hair was cut, their clothes replaced, their language punished. He also watched his uncle say something he would never forget: learn their words, but do not forget your own. So Dakota did both. By adulthood, he had become something rare, fluent in Apache traditions and capable of navigating white settlements without appearing lost. He understood trade routes, contracts, and the value settlers placed on money. He understood, too, the quiet hunger on the reservation when government shipments arrived late or spoiled. The West romanticizes warriors, but most Apache men in the 1880s were simply trying to keep their families alive under tightening control. When the trader approached Dakota with an offer, it was framed as ordinary work. "There's a woman," the trader said casually, as though discussing livestock, "causing unrest. The town wants her gone." Dakota did not immediately answer. He had taken tracking jobs before locating stolen cattle, guiding travelers safely through harsh terrain. Disappearances, however, carried weight. He asked careful questions. "Has she harmed anyone?" "No." "Broken the law?" "Not that I've heard." "Then what has she done?" The trader shrugged. "Doesn't belong." Teaching the wrong people. Dakota felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Doesn't belong. He had heard those words his entire life. They echoed through forced marshs, through fenced reservation lines, through government proclamations declaring land no longer his people's. He knew what happened when communities decided someone didn't belong. Still, survival demanded compromise. Rations were low. His younger cousins needed flour and salt. The reservation agent controlled distribution tightly. Sometimes work outside meant the difference between hunger and endurance. Dakota accepted the job not from cruelty, but calculation. This complexity matters. History often flattens Native men into stereotypes, either noble heroes or violent threats. The truth was more complicated. Many were navigating impossible circumstances, balancing dignity with survival. As Dakota rode toward Dusty Ridge, he observed quietly. White towns were puzzles to him, wooden buildings rising from land they claimed as permanent, though many would vanish within decades. Saloons filled with loud certainty. Churches preaching morality while ignoring injustice. He noticed how settlers rarely saw him as a man first. He was either feared or dismissed, invisible or dangerous. Never ordinary. The trader described Eleanor as trouble, but Dakota understood that word could mean many things. In his experience, those labeled trouble were often the ones who challenged unfair systems. He camped outside town for a day before making contact. He watched her from a distance first, not as prey, but as a tracker assessing truth. He saw no armed rebellion, no secret meetings plotting violence. He saw children. He saw a woman kneeling beside a small boy, guiding his hand as he shaped letters into sound. He saw Apache children allowed to speak, without shame. That unsettled him, not because it was wrong, but because it did not match the accusation. Dakota had seen government schools where Apache children were punished for speaking their mother tongue. Hair cut short, traditional clothing replaced, discipline enforced harshly. But here, in a fragile wooden shed, he saw something different. English was being added, not forced in place of identity. That difference was profound. For Native communities, cultural survival depended on adaptation without erasure. Many leaders believed learning English was necessary to defend land rights and navigate legal systems, but not at the cost of losing heritage. Courage does not always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like standing still when you know someone has come to end your story. When Dakota stepped from the shadows that evening, Eleanor Bennett understood more than she let show. The desert had grown too quiet. The wind carried that strange stillness that comes before something changes. She had grown up in Missouri, raised by a widowed mother who believed fear was useful but never a master. Her mother had once hidden 2 runaway slaves in their cellar before the war ended. Eleanor had been only a girl, but she remembered the trembling hands, the whispered prayers, and the decision to do what was right even when neighbors disapproved. Courage, her mother had told her, is not the absence of fear. It is deciding something else matters more. Now, facing an Apache tracker sent by men who wanted her gone, Eleanor felt fear, but she did not run. "You're not from town," she said evenly. Dakota's silence confirmed her suspicion. She saw no immediate malice in his posture, no raised weapon, no rush toward violence. He stood balanced, alert, but not aggressive. "They sent you?" she asked when he did not deny it. She inhaled slowly. Most people in Dusty Ridge believed Apache men were unpredictable, dangerous. But Eleanor had learned something in her short months in the territory. Fear often grew from ignorance. She chose conversation over panic. "If they want me gone," she said, adjusting the books in her arms, "they should say it to my face." That answer surprised him. She could see it. A slight narrowing of his eyes, not in anger, but curiosity. Instead of fleeing to her boarding room in town, she turned and walked toward the schoolhouse. It was a risk, but she sensed instinctively that treating him like a human being rather than a threat might change the direction of the evening. He followed. Inside the small building, the scent of chalk and desert dust lingered. Slates leaned against walls. A map of the United States, already outdated by shifting territories, hung crooked near the door. "You can look," she said. Quietly, Dakota stepped inside. He examined the room not as a hired hand assessing terrain, but as a man measuring truth. He saw Spanish words written beside English ones. He saw Apache symbols drawn carefully. Near phonetic spellings, he noticed something else. No signs of punishment. No switches. No rigid seating separating children by background. Eleanor set her books down and faced him fully. I know why they're angry, she said. I won't separate children by race. I won't forbid them from speaking their own language. Her voice did not tremble. In St. Louis, I saw what ignorance does. Men sign contracts they cannot read. Families lose land because they trust someone else's word. Education is protection. This is where the story carries deeper historical weight. In the late 19th century, literacy was power. Contracts, land deeds, voting rights, these were controlled through written law. Native communities often suffered because negotiations were conducted in English under pressure. Similarly, Mexican laborers in the Southwest were frequently exploited through legal documents they could not fully understand. Eleanor understood that reading was more than academic, it was defense. Dakota listened without interrupting. She did not speak down to him. She did not try to civilize him. She explained her mission as one human explaining a belief to another. I don't want to erase anyone, she continued softly. I want them to survive what's coming. He studied her carefully. He had seen white teachers before, some sincere, many convinced they were rescuing Native children from their own culture. But Eleanor's classroom did not feel like erasure. It felt like addition. Still, he had been paid. Town says you caused trouble, he finally said. A faint smile touched her lips. Trouble, she replied, is often just change wearing new clothes. The desert wind rattled the loose window frame. For the first time, Eleanor allowed a flicker of vulnerability. I won't beg, she said. If you've come to do what they asked, I won't fight you. But understand this, I am not their enemy. That sentence shifted something deeper than argument. She was offering him dignity in the choice, not pleading, not accusing. Trusting. O'Day had been treated as a weapon before, hired muscle, silent tracker, useful shadow. Rarely had someone acknowledged that he possessed moral agency. In that fragile wooden schoolhouse, two people stood at a crossroads shaped by forces larger than either of them. Expansion, prejudice, survival, fear. Eleanor's refusal to collapse into terror was not recklessness. It was conviction. She believed that meeting violence with humanity could alter its course. She did not yet know whether she was right, but she believed it was worth trying. Dakota stepped outside after a long silence. Looking across the darkening horizon, he could return to Dusty Ridge and claim the job finished. He could take the money and disappear, or he could acknowledge what he had witnessed, that this woman was not destabilizing the territory. She was strengthening its most vulnerable. Night after Dakota's first visit, Eleanor lay awake in her small rented room, the desert wind rattling the window shutters. She thought about what he had said and, more importantly, what he had not said. He had come to end her life, or at least make her vanish. Yet he had not lifted a weapon. He had not forced her to flee. He had simply observed, measured, and made a choice. And in that moment, Eleanor realized something profound. The person sent to destroy her could also protect her. Dakota returned at dawn. Dusty Ridge had given him a task, but Eleanor had given him a question. What kind of man would he choose to be? That question weighed heavily on him. In his life, most decisions were survival-driven. Feed the family, avoid soldiers, navigate treaties. But now, morality entered a realm that had no rations, no contracts, and no clear map. You cannot stay in town, Dakota said quietly as he approached her schoolhouse. They will not stop looking. They will not forgive what they think you've done. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I cannot abandon the children," she said, "nor the families who trusted me." Dakota exhaled slowly. He had come to believe she was not the enemy. She was not a threat. She was not reckless. She was, in fact, doing something extraordinary, teaching young minds how to survive and thrive in a world that often sought to erase them. "Then we do it another way," he said. "I will help you. Not because they hired me, not because I am paid, but because it is right." Here is where Part 4 highlights the ethical and educational theme. The West is often mythologized as a place of bullets and brawls, but the reality is that courage and survival often relied on alliances, judgment, and moral choices. Dakota and Eleanor's decision demonstrates that ethical courage can be just as life-changing as physical courage. Eleanor nodded. The schoolhouse felt warmer than it had before, not because of the fire she lit for morning lessons, but because of trust, a rare commodity on the frontier. Together, they made a plan. She would continue teaching, but they would relocate the schoolhouse to land closer to Apache families. Beyond the prying eyes of Dusty Ridge, Dakota would stand watch during the day and night, ensuring no harm came to her or the children. The risk was enormous. If Dusty Ridge discovered her new location, the consequences could be deadly. But the reward, education, and safety for the children was worth it. As they worked side by side, a quiet partnership formed. It was not yet romantic. It was a shared understanding that some things were larger than fear, money, or prejudice. She learned from him the ways of the land where rattlesnakes hid, how to read desert tracks, and which plants could be used for food or medicine. He learned from her the value of literacy and reasoning tools that could empower children to protect themselves and their families. Also carries historical insight. During this era, many Native and Mexican children were denied education or were forced to assimilate in ways that erased their languages and culture. Eleanor's school offered something revolutionary: learning without erasure. Her approach reflected a progressive idea for the time: education as empowerment rather than control. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the desert turned gold and crimson, Dakota made a statement that surprised even him. "I was hired to make you disappear. Instead, I think I will help you stay." Eleanor looked at him, a faint smile forming. "That is the better choice," she said softly. "Always the better choice." The desert seemed to exhale around them, acknowledging the decision. Dusty Ridge could send its men. Threats could come from outside. But for the moment, they had chosen a path that neither fear nor prejudice could erase. Their cooperation also became a subtle lesson for the community. Change is possible when people choose morality over expediency and humanity over orders. By refusing to comply blindly, Dakota exercised agency, something Native men were often denied in historical narratives, and Eleanor exercised courage, demonstrating that leadership is not always about authority, but about commitment to justice and compassion. Days passed. The schoolhouse thrived in its new location. Children learned not only English and arithmetic, but also respect for their heritage. Parents, initially hesitant, began to trust the arrangement. Dakota and Eleanor's teamwork showed that survival and morality could coexist, even in a hostile frontier environment. Of the story is pivotal because it transforms the narrative from one of potential violence to one of collaboration, trust, and conscious choice. The moment when Dakota decides to protect rather than eliminate Eleanor illustrates a critical lesson for the audience. Sometimes the hard. Even in the vast openness of the Arizona desert, rumors travel fast. Dusty Ridge was a small town, but news of Eleanor Bennett's survival beyond its borders reached every saloon, church, and homestead. Whispers became stories, stories became outrage. And soon a few of the town's men decided they needed to act. "They think they can defy us," one rancher said, slamming his fist on the table at the Dusty Ridge Saloon. "Send word? Not good enough. She's alive. I saw the boy she teaches. She's corrupting them." The council, already uneasy, felt mocked. Their original plan to quietly remove Eleanor from town had failed. In their eyes, allowing her to continue teaching outside their authority was an insult. And so, armed with rifles, pistols, and righteous certainty, a small group of men rode out into the desert. Dakota had anticipated this. He had not only tracked them as a possibility, but had prepared a network of allies. Apache families in the region had watched Eleanor teach. Mexican ranch hands had noticed her fairness and patience. Even a few white settlers' children were now literate because of her lessons. Together they formed a quiet, informal alliance, one that could counter the brute force Dusty Ridge was sending. When the riders reached the schoolhouse, Dakota did not meet them with violence. He understood the logic of fear. Men like these believed in intimidation first, reasoning later. Instead, he arranged witnesses. Elders from the Apache community, ranchers, and mothers whose children had been educated by Eleanor stood where they could be seen. Their presence was not a threat, but it was unmistakable. Eleanor was not alone, and she was protected. "You call her danger," Dakota said evenly, his voice carrying over the quiet desert. "But your own children read because of her. She does not harm. She teaches." For a moment, silence fell over the group. Some of the Dusty Ridge men squinted at the small gathering. They had expected compliance or fear. Instead, they saw dignity, unity, and moral clarity. One mother stepped forward, her hands calloused from tending the ranch. "My son can read his name now," she said. "He knows more than I ever could at his age." She helped him. That is all she wants to help. The riders hesitated. They had trained for confrontation, for showing dominance. But dominance relies on obedience, and these men were confronted with proof that obedience could not be forced here. Eleanor was not a pawn, and Dakota was not a mercenary. This moment carries educational and historical depth. In the American West, Native communities often had to rely on alliances, witness accounts, and moral authority to protect themselves against settlers' aggression. Legal systems were skewed, and violence was a frequent threat. Eleanor's school became a microcosm of cooperation and resilience. Diverse people coming together to defend education and cultural survival. Dusty Ridge's men had choices. They could escalate, risking bloodshed, or retreat. The presence of witnesses, combined with the realization that Eleanor's work was beneficial and morally defensible, forced them to reconsider. Gunfights in the West often dominate legends, but many confrontations ended without violence when wisdom, community, and restraint intervened. After a tense few moments, the men lowered their weapons. They spoke in mutters, blaming circumstance, fear, and pride. They turned their horses back toward town, unwilling to commit to the bloodshed that would have followed. Dusty Ridge had not been defeated, but it had been shown that fear alone could not dictate outcomes. For Eleanor and Dakota, the confrontation was a confirmation. Their partnership had survived a direct challenge. Their school was safe, at least for now. And more importantly, they had demonstrated the power of moral courage over brute force. Dakota reflected quietly on the encounter. He realized that his life, once measured by survival alone, could now be shaped by principle. He could choose to protect and uplift rather than obey orders blindly. Eleanor had reminded him that agency, when guided by justice, was a form of strength that could reshape the desert itself. Eleanor, in turn, understood the weight of her own choices. Fear had not dictated her actions. She had refused to be invisible. She had trusted Dakota and the community, and in doing so, she had not only preserved her school, but had modeled for her students the lessons she sought to teach: courage, reason, and collaboration. This confrontation also illustrates a broader social lesson for the audience. Change often comes not from dominating others, but from demonstrating integrity, fairness, and the ability to form alliances across divides. Dusty Ridge may still have its prejudices, but it could no longer act unchecked. Communities that attempt to suppress progress often face resistance in unexpected ways. By the end of this chapter, the foundation for lasting transformation has been laid. Eleanor's schoolhouse is a beacon of knowledge and cultural respect. Dakota's decision to protect her rather than follow orders has shifted the narrative of power in the region. And Dusty Ridge has learned, however reluctantly, that fear and force are weaker than unity and principle. The desert wind carried a subtle message that evening: courage, moral clarity, and collaboration could withstand threats, even in a land where law was often selective and survival demanded vigilance. Eleanor and Dakota had not only survived, they had created a model for community, education, and ethical resistance that would endure long after the Dusty Ridge men returned home. Months passed in the quiet desert beyond Dusty Ridge. Eleanor's schoolhouse thrived, its small walls filled with children's laughter, the scratching of chalk on slates, and the hum of new ideas. Children learned to read, to count, to write letters in English, but they also spoke Spanish and Apache. Preserving the voices their parents feared would vanish. For Dakota, the months were a lesson in patience and understanding. He had not been hired to protect Eleanor indefinitely, yet every sunrise and sunset he found himself drawn to her steadfast courage, her unwavering belief in justice, and her commitment to children who might otherwise have been forgotten by the world. He watched how she treated each child with respect, how she listened to elders, and how she confronted Dusty Ridge's judgment with quiet confidence. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the desert in gold and crimson, Dakota sat beside her on the wooden porch. He had grown used to sharing long silences with her, and there was a sense of peace that neither had expected in a land so often defined by violence. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I was hired to make you disappear," he said. "Instead," he paused, searching for words, "I chose to help you stay." Eleanor turned toward him, a gentle smile touching her lips. "It was the better choice," she replied. "Always the better choice." Dakota's heart, long hardened by years of survival and loss, stirred in a way he had not anticipated. He realized that, in his own life, he had never been asked a question as simple and profound as this: "Who do you choose to be?" Eleanor had not demanded loyalty, nor had she tried to control him. She had recognized his agency, his capacity for morality, and she had trusted him. In Apache culture, marriage is often understood as a partnership, an agreement between two people to walk life's path together, side by side, respecting each other's decisions, strength, and heritage. Dakota, shaped by both his upbringing and his experiences with Eleanor, saw the opportunity to honor that tradition while also embracing a new life he had never imagined. "In my people's way," he said carefully, "marriage is partnership. You walk beside me, not behind. Is that what you want?" Eleanor considered his words. It was the first time in her life someone had asked her what she truly wanted, without presumption or expectation. After a moment, she nodded. "Yes," she said, "their marriage was small, quiet, and deeply meaningful." Apache elders sang traditional songs while the children of the school watched with curiosity. Eleanor's friends from Dusty Ridge did not attend, but their absence was inconsequential. The ceremony was about commitment, respect, and choice, not spectacle. A silver band, small but elegant, rested on Eleanor's finger, a symbol of the partnership they had consciously chosen. Together they continued their work. The school grew, attracting more children from surrounding communities. Parents who had once feared retribution from Dusty Ridge began sending their children to learn under Eleanor's guidance. She taught literacy, arithmetic, history, and critical thinking. Dakota ensured safety and provided lessons on Apache traditions, tracking, and survival in the desert. Children learned not only how to read words but also how to honor their roots, their land, and their communities. Through this union, Eleanor and Dakota demonstrated a profound truth. The Wild West was not only a place of conflict and lawlessness. It was also a place where trust, collaboration, and moral courage could flourish. Their partnership, born out of a threat of violence, transformed the landscape around them. It showed the power of agency, the importance of mutual respect, and the enduring strength of education as both protection and empowerment. Even Dusty Ridge, though distant, slowly adjusted. The town could no longer claim moral superiority, nor could it enforce ignorance or fear as authority. Some families eventually allowed their children to attend Eleanor's school, recognizing that learning could not be suppressed indefinitely. The West, as harsh and unforgiving as it was, had witnessed the subtle power of knowledge, choice, and alliance. Dakota and Eleanor's life together became a testament to the fact that survival is not enough. True life requires